We are live, alive, and live. Tonight we're in the book of Esther. We're going to look at the first 5 chapters in what I call the big ideas of the book of Esther. And I asked you last week to be thinking about those chapters and maybe come up with a one-word idea or a phrase or some concept from each one of those chapters. We'll look at chapter 1 first, and then we'll go to chapter 2. And when we get done with 5, depending on how long it takes us to get there, then we're done. So you might get to go home early. It's early release day if you don't have anything to say. Because if you leave it up to the preacher, we'll be here till time. So I did fill out my outline for the first 5 chapters just in case. But I was hoping we would at least have some conversation tonight about the book of Esther. Spent a lot of time, not really in lecture, but we're looking at the book together, talking about ideas, different things we saw. And I told you that when we got to the end, it would be participatory. And so you're able to contribute as much as you want. And I'm just here to kind of fill in the gaps, more as a facilitator than the leader of the discussion by looking at the text. But hopefully you've at least went back and said, I remember what chapter 1 was about. That's what I always try to do. And I always tried to do that every week so that I could have some continuity of discussion. This was the flow of the book. And so tonight we'll just look at the first 5 chapters. Next week we'll look at the last 5 chapters. And then after that is we're going to look at the Amalekites. And then I think the next week after that, Mike's going to teach. And then I think there's only 2 weeks after that. And then 1 week is going to be Purim. And we're going to look at that celebratory event. And then the last week of June, the last Wednesday of June, unless something crazy happens and I change my mind, we're going to spend that entire night looking at Esther as a person, as the concept for the book. We'll do a conclusion by looking at her more particularly than what we would have done tonight in chapter 2. We'll spend the entire 30 or 40 minutes or whatever it takes looking at Esther as a person, even the idea of the book, and what we can basically learn from the whole thing as a whole unit. But spend most of our time looking at Esther and the different influences she's had throughout the Bible, even though she's not mentioned anywhere else in the Bible. And so we'll take a look at that final week. So when we're looking at chapter 1, did anybody, if you did your homework, did anybody want to share what you got? What'd you have for chapter 1? We know a little bit about what it's about. It's this celebratory event, probably a preparation, bringing counsel in and getting ready maybe to go off to battle. And the king has a long event, 6 months party, 180 days, and then he has a 7-day event, and then he invites the queen to come before the court, and she rejects the invitation, and basically the council says, what do we need to do? She's going to ruin the country if she doesn't behave, kind of thing. And so that's the context of chapter 1. Did anybody have an idea or a concept or even just something they wanted to share about chapter 1 that impressed them or maybe confused them a little bit? So that's where we'll start. Anybody? Dave's got an idea. Take as long as you need because we got all night.
I wasn't in the class when you did these first chapters, but I was struck by verse 14, where when this issue comes up about what to do about Vashti, he summons these guys and they name them. Mm-hmm. Where were these guys when
Haman?
When Haman was coming up with his plan and all of that stuff. Where were those guys at?
Yeah, that's a good thought. If these were his chief people, but now we also need to remember that it's about, I think, Esther gets appointed 3 years after chapter 1, and then basically when, chapter 4 opens up, chapter 3? When Haman comes on the scene and has crowned the prime minister, that's 5 more years. So we're 8 years removed. So something happened with the queen or whatever in those 5 years. But that's an excellent observation. Where's the king's wise counsel when Haman is appointed prime minister and kind of basically turns over everything. That's a great point. Anybody else? Carol's got something?
My sister's women's group, their Bible study's been studying Esther, this ladies' class,
Oh,
their
good,
ladies' class, yeah. And something I've never noticed, and she mentioned that it came up in their class, and if you read it, when it says he ordered the queen to be brought before him, wearing her royal crown and her display, she said in the research that the woman did in her book that the queen was to be brought naked before everybody.
Yeah, we kind of alluded to that when
And-
we did chapter 1, but we don't know for sure, but yes.
Yeah, but
A number of people suggested that was a possibility, which would lend to the fact that whatever's going on, here's this drunken stupor, and the king says, bring the queen in her crown, and so yeah. Yeah, that's crazy, isn't it?
Yeah, well, and it gives more reason that she would say.
No. You're drunk? Go to bed. Anybody else?
Well, it just interests me how he, through this 180-day long, half a year long party, and just from the descriptions here, there was a massive amount of wealth displayed and probably spent doing all this. And I don't know much about the economics of the ancient world, but
Persia had all the money.
that was a lot of money to blow just on a big party. And I think about all of the people that probably lived and worked in that society that didn't get invited to the party, but they still had to work to pay for it. I don't know.
Yeah, they were allowed to come the last 7 days.
Yeah, they had to work the rest of the time, and nobles got to party. Kind of like some of our modern societies. And just the amount of wealth displayed here
Yep.
was amazing.
Yeah, I don't know that we actually got into anything like that, so that's a good point. In today's time, a 6-month, because it was kind of we said it was kind of a diplomatic thing. He's bringing people in from all the different provinces, because he's getting ready to go to battle with Greece. At least we suspect so, because in chapter 2, he's basically devoid of all of his manhood, at least mentally, defeated by the Greeks, and comes home, and that's when he decides he needs another queen. And so this 6-month event was the diplomatic, I'm going to wine and dine you, and you're going to tell me how I can win. And so, a lot. And then after this chapter, leading up to chapter 2, the amount of money spent in a kingdom like this, probably millions, if not billions, in today's money. That's a long time to be, celebrating and letting everybody know, look how good I am. And that's one of the points I would bring out here in a few minutes. Anybody else? Chapter 1, I titled it Power and Control. And the power part is kind of like what Chris was saying, and the control part was kind of like what Carol was saying. Here's this idea of, let me show you how big I am. Here's this king. And Persia, it's a big area. Remember, it's from Ethiopia to India, 127 provinces. This is a lot of population. This is the entire kingdom of Persia. If you know anything about, like I've watched movies sometimes and they'll talk about the Persian kings, and before I knew anything about the Bible, you'd hear their names and you're like, okay, whatever. But the global influence that Persia had is obvious in the Bible. We've got, Cyrus named as a deliverer. And so, God allowed Babylon to humble Israel, and then he allows Persia to defeat Babylon and rescue Israel. But ultimately, some wanted to stay, and we talked about that in the first chapter. Here's this power, some good, some maybe not so good. And then the control idea. Xerxes, Ahasuerus, however you want to identify him in this book, I don't know that he was necessarily power hungry, but he did not mind displaying his power and authority and rule. It doesn't necessarily reflect the fact that he thinks, well, I'm almighty, I'm all powerful. We're going to leave that to Haman in a few chapters. But hey, you go do whatever you want to do, just keep the money coming in kind of thing. As long as everybody keeps doing what they're supposed to do, as long as I can be the most powerful person in your world, then I'm good. Now, the control part is usually goes hand in hand with power. With power comes the ability to control. What happens in this chapter to reflect opposite of that is when his queen says, I'm not doing it. So when she says, I'm not doing it, we think about, now comes the ultimatum time. I don't know that he's as furious as like Dave said. Here are these advisors that say, King, you may not realize what just happened. She's not coming. And she's been kind of defiant about not coming. And now, what are you going to do about it? Well, and then they say, well, I think we ought to do this. And so they do that. But the king is usually, I put in here in quotes in my notes, my way or the highway, only by way of just illustrating. It's not necessarily this king's method of enforcement. Either you do it my way or you're gone. It's not exactly like that. It seems like the council felt that way, and they had enough influence over him that, call it reasonable or yielding to your counsel, whether it's good or bad. We know what happened to Solomon. We know what happened to Rehoboam. We know what happened when they yielded to the council. What happens to those individuals is not always good. Sometimes it's good. When Esther yields to the counsel of Mordecai, things seem to turn out pretty good. But so when you think about power and control, that's a good, I think, at least for me, it was a great way to memorize this chapter because you see both elements. With that being said, anybody got anything else? I got a couple more things about this chapter before we move on. Gary, you got something?
Howard, I had royalty is on display with insubordination, discounting authority, and which echoes the same thing everybody else is saying. But with the king getting to the point where he is on display, and now with insubordination, in order for him to continue to be so, he's got to take action.
Or at least his counsel thought he did.
Yes.
Yeah. So there's another good word there. I might even write that one down. Embarrassment. There's an embarrassment factor in this chapter. The king could have easily lost some credibility. Yeah. So if you don't mind, give me just a second, because I don't even remember how to spell embarrassment. So we'll get it close, and I'll do spell check when I get there. But I want to look at a couple proverbs. Was that it, Gary? You had some more stuff?
That's it.
Okay. Let's look at a couple proverbs, and I want to look at Proverbs 14 first. So if you want to put your marker in Esther so you can get back to it, that'd be great. So Proverbs 14, just as a way of illustration, some of these concepts. Chapter 14, verse number 29. And I thought it was interesting because New King James in my Bible has a little margin rendering for a word, and we'll talk about that just for a second. Proverbs 14:29. He who is slow to wrath has great understanding, but he who is impulsive exalts folly. When I'm looking at the commentaries and they would make biblical references, this was one of those passages for this chapter. Here's a king who could have made rash choices or could have been tempered. It just seems to illustrate that there is a seasoning among authority especially. And I thought it was interesting. I've always looked at the word impulsive, and I describe it as like you jump in with both feet and then you look around. That's my definition of impulsive. You just do it and then you figure out where you're at once you get there. This said, literally it means short of spirit. In other words, it wasn't necessarily completely thought out, reasonable, or whatever. So just as one of the passages, and then the next passage should help illustrate this passage, which is chapter 31 of Proverbs. And that's why I picked these two together. 31 verses 4 and 5. This is Lemuel's mother. It is not for kings, O Lemuel. It is not for kings to drink wine, nor for princes intoxicating drink, lest they drink and forget the law and pervert the justice of all the afflicted. And so there were about a dozen passages about alcohol or making rash judgments or being immature in the book of Proverbs that seem to illustrate possibly how we could view Esther chapter 1. And I think it goes back to when we don't know what to do, the first thing we do as a humanity, not maybe as Christians, but as a humanity is, we generally want to either find someone that has the answer or find someone to agree with us about the circumstance. And so sometimes that brings us equally as low because now we can stay low because someone else is low, or we can seek out counsel to do something to either build our self-esteem or build our ego or whatever, or to advance us to a better place. In this particular case, it doesn't necessarily say that the king called for the council, but the council made themselves available. If you look at chapter 1, verse 13, then the king said to the wise men who understand the times, let's see, maybe I need to back up just a little bit. Let's back up to verse 11. To bring Queen Vashti before the king wearing her royal crown in order to show her beauty to the people and the officials, for she was beautiful to behold. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command, brought by his eunuchs. Therefore the king was furious and his anger burned within him. So he's just mad because she didn't come. Then it says, then the king said to the wise men who understood the times, basically, for this was the king's manner to yield to those who knew the law. The king's being king. He knows there's laws out there. He knows he's made the laws, but he's not necessarily, at least as evidence in this point in time, maybe because it's been 6 months of revelry, he's like, I need to get somebody in here to help me make I can't even say a wise decision. Just somebody in here that's thinking clearly that can help me figure this out. And basically, they told him, expel, excommunicate, dethrone the queen. Go ahead, Chris.
Well, I was thinking about the proverb that said a wise king has many counselors. Solomon said that. And there is wisdom in that. If you're going to make a law or make some kind of a proclamation as a powerful king, you do need counsel so that you don't mess it up.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, he messed up,
Well, we don't know that he did.
Well, he did, especially with Haman later. He let a really bad law be passed because of Haman's counsel.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know that he got more than Haman's counsel. At that point, he just listened to Haman instead of his wise men and group. He might would have made a better choice if he'd had many counselors in that case.
Anything else for chapter 1? Let's go to chapter 2. Chapter 2 is about 3 years removed from that event. That's in chapter 1. There's been potentially battles, maybe as many as 2 battles, a defeat or a victory, and then a defeat. But it appears as if from secular history that he was defeated and then won back some of that. So he came back home with some level of pride or accomplishment, the king did, from the Greeks. And he begins to long for his queen, and so his council again says, why don't we figure out how to get you another queen? And so they made an announcement to all of the provinces, and all of the beautiful ladies come to town, and over a period of months, they're prepared, and they begin to march in front of the king, and ultimately Esther is chosen as the new queen. And then when we get to chapter 3, 5 years have elapsed before Haman's actually, well, I shouldn't say chapter 3. When we get down here to, chapter 3. That's when Haman's basically appointed, and we'll talk about him when we get to chapter 3. So, all of the preparation, the etiquette, the walk, the beauty, the preparation, whatever, the dress, the manner of speech, the way to approach, those kinds of things. Well, they call it charm school back in the day, didn't they? Wasn't it charm school? I don't know. I'm guessing. So, anybody have something they want to share about what their impression of chapter 2 was? Maybe in a snapshot, kind of like what we did for chapter 1. Anybody got something for chapter 2? Okay. Nobody? Okay. Chapter 2, I titled it for me, Beauty Inside and Out. Because we get a glimpse of Esther and what she's like on the outside, and a little bit about what she's like on the inside. On the outside, obviously, evidently, according to the text, a number of people saw her as something special. And there was one particular, it was Haggith. Was it Haggith? The eunuch in charge of the preparation of the women. He took special favor with her and gave her, special servants and gave her a special place to stay and gave her dedicated instruction. Evidently, there was something about Esther on the inside and on the outside that said, this person is special. Now, don't judge me. We're in church. I love American Idol. Some of those young people, they've got the talent, but not the social skills. And some of them are just as pretty as can be and have great manners and social skills and zero talent. And every once in a while, you get this ugly old country singer that's 20-something years old that somehow charms and wows these young girls. And we all say, how's that even possible? When we think about things like that, and I do, never been wholly handsome. Beauty's in the eye of the beholder, right? Fellas, we know that our wives choiced us for their reasons, not necessarily our reasons, and that's okay. And ladies, the same thing. If the fellas saddled up to you for the same thing, there was something about you, inside and out. Yeah, she thought she was marrying Howard Johnson, and she married me instead. So anyway, yes, it wasn't my money. Reminds us, if we take the time to think about it, that it's not just how we look. It says in a couple of places, like she honored her family, and she honored her uncle or cousin, depending on how you see Mordecai, and he had made some, requests of her, parental requests, which usually can be interpreted as a demand or an expectation, and she honored those, and so there was honor. But then some will look at, and Miss Carol, I don't know what you guys talked about with your class on chapter 2, but we talked a little bit about it, about this was purely a beauty contest for the king. I think he was overwhelmed the minute she walked in the door. Posture and good looks is all he cared about. It appears that way in the chapter, but the chapter reveals more about Esther than just that. So the lesson to learn is you can be smart and beautiful, and you can be beautiful and smart. And God expects us to fully illustrate ourselves to His glory. And Esther appeared to have done that, even though we may not agree with her ethics and not saying who she is and where she's from. Those are arguments we can make, but that doesn't change the fact that in this particular context, evidently there was some history. And we're going to see that history in chapter 3 with Haman. There must have been a reason out here that I don't tell anybody I'm a Jew. And Mordecai saw it and told Esther, Hadassah, don't say anything about what nation you're from. Let's just let it go for right now. And then ultimately at the end of the chapter, Mordecai hears of a conspiracy, gives it to his niece. His niece takes it to the king, and the king sends word down and proves that it's true and has those assassins executed. Again, this is Esther honoring her position. What would have happened if the king would have died? She might have lost her position, or whatever. It doesn't matter. But the context says that she did what was right. She heard it, she reported it, and saved the king. ultimately Mordecai is going to get the credit for it later on when the king has insomnia and hears the book and basically parades him through town and he becomes the next prime minister. But at this point in time, Esther's exhibiting honor, integrity, probably a measure of dignity. I don't know what goes on in those parades before the king. Could have been a lot like what the king was asking for in chapter 1. I don't know. So to fully declare her maturity in how she would respond to those things, the text doesn't suggest anything other than just doing the right thing. Chris?
Well, something that I see all through the Bible is that God uses people in the position he puts them in, and he uses the situation as it is.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of times in the Bible that the situation isn't ideal, but God still works in it, or the person is not ideal, but he still uses them for his purposes and his glory. And I think obviously Esther was in the right place at the right time, and God mightily used her to rescue the whole nation. So I'm sure she had flaws, nobody's perfect, but she was the right person at the right time.
Yeah.
And whether she was perfect in every one, we can't argue that she properly did everything in this scenario because we don't know. But chances are she made some mistakes, and God still used that.
Mm-hmm. And I don't know, I don't remember, I didn't have it in my notes, but we could have talked about it. I don't remember. Maybe you remember. Another example that would illustrate this idea of exactly what Chris said was Rahab and the spies. I mean, the text says she was a harlot. Yet what do we know about Rahab? She's in the lineage of the Savior. Go figure, right? That's a perfect illustration of exactly what you're talking about. Esther's position was honorable. God used her to save his people. And it's not for us to decide if God was obviously right. So we got to at least look at that. Here's God was right, so let's figure out how Esther could promote all of it. And we see it towards the end too. She's honored just as well.
An example that comes to my mind is Joseph.
Well,
In fact, I thought of him before I thought of Rahab, that he's a little different in that he's in a dishonorable position, but God's able to use that as well.
yeah, amen. Amen. Yeah, in an unfortunate situation, doing righteous things, absolutely. And we can find ourselves sometimes in a very similar position, maybe at work, or maybe in the community, or maybe even in our own homes, where it may not be the best of circumstances, but it can turn out for good. We just got to trust God. And we'll see that here in a few minutes. Okay.
Howard, can I make just
Yes,
one
sir.
comment? I had God uses Esther's beauty and her obedience, to gain trust as a queen. And throughout, it was interesting as you went through the book, for me, I had said, God is up there. He's not being actively involved in it, yet he is.
Mm-hmm.
So he got used, or he uses Esther's beauty, but also she was very obedient.
Yeah, and it started before then, didn't it? Because evidently we see some reference in there that Mordecai trained her, and she had this, I'll even go as far as to say, she had moral character. She had integrity. And that's not necessarily something she would have seen from the community. She got the integrity from the home because she honored Mordecai. She did as Mordecai, as the family suggested or told her or trained her. Yeah. Okay. Now, Chris. Good.
One thing that I think is really awesome about the Bible is how many broken people God uses to do amazing things. I'm really thankful for that because that gives me a little hope. I've got issues. We all do. Things that we need to work on. But God can still use us because he's God. He can make a silk purse out of a sow's ear.
Is that in the Bible somewhere?
No, it's in the Southern Bible, probably.
It's in that Sutherland Bible.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. You know, I'm a living example. You know, I can say that about me. You can or can't, you know, everybody could probably say it about themselves. There's moments in our lives that were embarrassing, frustrating, we're ashamed. You know, we needed to repent of specific things. And I'm sure Esther did too. It doesn't allude to any, and it might have been on a daily basis she's confessing to God things in her life. Okay. Anybody else got anything from chapter 2? So chapter 1 was basically, here's this power and control, and then here's this inner peace, this quiet, basically maybe a temperate person, which was probably a lot like Vashti, but from a different race. I mean, we don't know. And then we also learned some things about Esther that were, just like you said, she had some flaws. But evidently there was enough there of a person of integrity and in the right house and doing the right thing and with the right motivation, she was asked to do something very important for her people. So, beauty inside and out. Chapter number 3, I didn't know exactly. This one's tough. Chapter 3 was tough. Anybody got, before I get into mine, before we even talk about the chapter, basically it's Haman and his contempt for the Jews and what he does. But anybody have a theme for the chapter or an idea? Anybody had something they wanted to say? Anybody?
I'll share mine.
Sure, yes sir.
Is the king issues an edict throughout the province to annihilate the Jews.
Okay. So there's this proclamation, this edict, this decree to wipe out an entire race of people. The focus of the chapter for me was the introduction of the character of Haman. And when we first introduced the chapter, I said the first 4 chapters kind of introduce people. You know, there was Vashti and the king, and then there was Esther, and now there's Haman. You know, and Mordecai is going to have some access here too. You know, he was introduced in chapter 2. So here's the introduction of these characters with plot lines. They all got a plot line. You know, what's Vashti's plot line? You know, it sets up the stage for this excommunication or this exile of somebody that was probably doing the right thing. And how now here comes this young maiden who's from a family, and then here comes Mordecai who saves the king, and then here comes Haman. About 5 years later, the text says, in a certain year of the king, here's Haman. And we're going to talk about his heritage and his background in a couple weeks. We're going to look very specifically at the Amalekites. And, you know, Dave brought this up, and he challenged me to do some research, and we'll see how that goes in a couple weeks. That thread of the Amalekites goes way back. I mean, like way back in the text of history. How much of that plays into this is, you know, you are who you are because of where you came from. And we are who we are because of what we've done in most recent days. So based on those things, everybody has a history. Some of it we're proud of, maybe some of it we're not so proud of. Maybe we had an important military person or an important civic leader in our family, and then it skipped 3 or 4 generations of just rednecks and hillbillies, and here we are. And then we get to decide if we want to be a redneck or a politician. You know, there's the choices we make are influenced by really where we came from. And ultimately, when we see Christ, now it's where we're going to. And we begin to see or make some changes. Here's Haman. He's all about himself. This is a guy that, and I hadn't really placed and I'm going to go back and I'll look at this some more. Nothing was said in the commentary about the previous council from, 8 years ago, where they're at now. Who knows? Maybe they died in battle, or maybe Haman pushed them all out when he got promoted to prime minister. But right now, the prime minister is Haman, and he's got the ear of the king. And he's from a certain tribe, and we learn that Mordecai is from a certain tribe, and then we see that clash in chapter 3. So in chapter 3, for the lack of a better term, and I really thought this phrase, at least in context, was in the Bible, but I couldn't find it. So maybe you can find it. I looked at all different combinations of the idea and the concept. I couldn't find this phrase, but the phrase is envy rots the spirit. And I looked at like envy is a cancer to the bone. I couldn't find anything with that relationship, but it's true. Envy eats up the inside. It ruins the spirit of a man and a woman. The idea of envy is you're where either you're doing something I want to do or you're not doing something that I want you to do. That's kind of the envy. There's like a two-sided head to envy. Haman wanted Mordecai, he wanted everybody to bow to him. Well, I shouldn't say he wanted them to. It's kind of like an expectation with the role of prime minister. It was an expectation. As I move through the kingdom and you see me, I'm the signet ring. I'm the one, the voice of the king. You need to bow to the king or you need to honor the position. And Mordecai refused. Couple things, and we talked about them in chapter 3. Couple things that kind of click this and twist it just a little bit is the relationship between the families of Haman and Mordecai. We don't know immediately. We don't see it in the text. They're named in the text, but we don't know that they know each other to that degree. We don't see them. All Haman knows is he's a Jew. But we don't know that he knows he's from Kish. We don't know that. But he does know the Jewish people. It could be that the writer illustrated that just to remind us that there was a family feud like the Hatfields and the McCoys, and only one of us is going to be left standing. And Haman's done with Mordecai, and he decides he's going to get rid of all the Jews. This is that extremism that comes from racism, at least when you're angry or envious. Either Mordecai's not doing what he wants him to do or he's got something that he doesn't have. Could be the character, could be the discipline of I'm not bowing to someone who is not honorable. Mordecai probably knew something about Haman and said, I'm not bowing to him. It might have been his heritage. It might have been where he was from or the fact that he's illegitimate. We don't know that. We just know that Mordecai, but we did talk about it in chapter 3 that we believed, or at least I believed, and trying to impress upon you that Mordecai was probably not going to bow to him because he's not the king, and his religion or his spirit would not let him do that. It would not have been the right thing for him. Now for the king, the Bible talks about it in a multiple of places that we are to honor those in position of authority. Mordecai might not have recognized his position. We don't know. So number 2, first of it is this racial complex, this conflict. And then the number 2 was Mordecai's got some contemporaries that tried to counsel him. It kind of goes back to the counsel of chapter 1. You need to get rid of Vashti. So here's a similar situation where the counsel comes and Mordecai doesn't listen to the counsel. He's not overly concerned with the fact that something might happen to him. He says, I'm not doing it. Mordecai obviously had a reason. We see the history of him trying to pass on honorable things to Esther, so we would assume that he's an honorable person. Remember now, when we're looking at this part of the text, when we're looking at this conversation, we're not in the text. We're supposing and we're asking and we're having a conversation about this. So these are things that I would not bring up when I'm talking about the text, but we can talk about them because we need to try to at least come, not so much to a consensus, but if it helps you understand a little bit. That's what I want us to do. I don't have any evidence for what I'm saying, but I'm saying these are things that are a possibility. Mordecai would not bow to Haman. That's fact. Counsel comes to Mordecai, says, what's going on? This isn't good. It's not going to end well for you. Mordecai says no. So what do his counselors do? Do you remember what the counselors of Mordecai did next? They went to the palace. They said, well, maybe if we just tell on him, then maybe he'll yield. And so when Haman finds out that Mordecai is not bowing to him, what happens to Haman? That's when he gets furious, because now he knows there's one. You know, this is that envy. This is that spirit of just, I can't stand it. You know, he's one of those Jews and they've never been worth much. They're just sorry labor, and you know, I'm going to fix him. I'm going to fix him, and I'm going to fix all his people. I'm done with them. And he goes to the king and explains that there's this race of people. Yes, go ahead.
I think it just goes to show that when you get counsel, even though it might be genuine from the person you're getting it from and that they might be sincere,
Yeah, they're really looking out for you.
you know, that doesn't necessarily mean it's the right counsel. So we have to be careful where we get our counsel from.
Yeah, it does, and it seemed to suggest that they were in some way contemporaries, like they might have been acquaintances or friends or co-workers kind of thing. You know how we, well, yes, exactly. Be careful. Be careful the counsel that's offered. You know, you might want to search out counsel, but evidently Mordecai didn't feel like he needed any. So then here's this decree that's going to, and there's, and I listed a bunch of things here. I've got manipulation. You know, the servants are trying to manipulate Mordecai. Well, we can't convince him, so we'll tell on him. You know, that manipulation or that peer pressure kind of thing. And then there's divination. There's some witchcraft going on in this chapter. Haman's obviously seeking something else to help him decide what day and time and place, and either that's a common practice, you know, like astrology or palm reading. You know, let me get some counsel here. Again, we're talking about, this chapter is about counsel. You know, where did Haman get his counsel? From the devil. You know, the divination and then the lies. These people are going to take over. They're going to destroy the unity of the nation. Same kind of report that was made about Vashti. If we don't fix her, she's going to ruin all the women in the nation. Here, if we don't fix him, he's going to ruin it for everybody. We need to get rid of him. And while we're at it, we need to just get rid of all of his family and all of his kinsmen. Just make it happen. The deception being that they're going to take over, or they're going to destroy the nation. And then ultimately, this one's a harder one to explain because it's an individual thing. One sin leads to another, like a cover-up kind of thing, or a compromise, which leads to another sin, which leads to maybe to another compromise, or begins to attract other people. You know, just like James says in, I think it's James chapter 3, verse 1, you know, don't let there be that many teachers because you're going to receive a stricter judgment. You know, the awesome responsibility of trying to persuade people to do anything, the right thing, the wrong thing. There's a consequence for that act of persuasion. So it's compounded now till there's issued a formal decree that we've already seen evidence of in chapter 1 and in chapter 2. A decree has been sent out that we know once the king stamps it or somebody can't be broken. We've already learned that previously. There's letters that go out and it can't be changed. It cannot be edited, redacted. It can't be amended. So envy, pride is a horrible thing. And I've got some passages, but I want to go ahead and at least cover initially chapters 4 and 5. But Gary, did you have something on that chapter? Did we talk about that? For chapter 3?
No, sir.
Okay. Chapter 4. We spent a lot of time in chapter 4, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time there tonight because this is that pivotal chapter where the word gets to Esther. Mordecai's out at the gate, finally gets the attention of the servants, gets word to Esther. Basically, Esther's real hesitant about approaching the king because there's a protocol to approach. And basically, Mordecai says, you know, if you don't do it, help's going to come from somewhere else, and your whole family's going to die. And maybe you're here for just this time. And we talked about this when we introduced chapter 1. Just even tonight again, we said, you know, everything leads up to there's some event, there's some reason that God is working in this family. And this is the reason. Esther is in a position to make a difference. And so what's Esther ask everybody to do? She asked her servants to do it. She asked Mordecai to do it. And for how long? Let's have a time of fasting. It doesn't say prayer there, but we talked about you can pray without fasting, but you can't fast without praying. And I asked anyone, you know, I challenge you that fasting is obviously a mental and a physical devotion to a particular cause. You can't do fasting without prayer. Okay, go ahead.
The fasting part, what I found was interesting is it's really, really hard to fast for 3 days. Really, really hard. I've done it a few times, and yeah, you have to pray.
Yeah.
But
Just,
in
Lord, let
looking
me
at
just
it-
eat one cookie and I'll be
and
good.
what she's doing is she was sacrificing herself to God before turning around and and putting herself at risk with the king.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so I just
And we didn't talk about this at the time because it would have been supposition, but how did she know to fast and why was now the right time? Because somewhere she was taught that when it's an extreme or a crisis situation, here's something you can, should, maybe even must do as you prepare to do. You know, it could have been easily in chapter 2, it could have been mentioned for her to fast before she went before the king. It didn't say that. It could have been that she fasted there too. But here was an extreme crisis situation. That, and I've got some passages that I even called it the therapy session. I've got, for such a time as this, the therapy session. Here's, Mordecai saying, you need to do this because these are the consequences, and, it's your time to shine. You're in a position, you can make a real difference, trying to motivate her, encourage her, provide some therapy, some counsel. So she said, okay, give me 3 days. I don't think she's putting him off. I think she's really wanting to prayerfully consider this in fasting. But it doesn't say that, but we would hope that's true. And Gary, did you have anything? Because I know evidently you've done your homework. You've got notes there.
Well, you asked me last night if I did my homework, so I
Yes.
had to go home.
Okay, well, good.
The only thing I had was that she fasts for deliverance.
Okay, yeah.
So she fasts for deliverance. So as a group, when she is finally relieved, okay, is the credit goes back to God.
Is it okay to ask for corporate fasting? A lot of the text in the New Testament talks about doing those kinds of things privately. And sometimes it would appear, especially in the New Testament, that it's an individual thing. As, don't let the world see what you're doing because you're doing something for your reparation. And you're not to go out and broadcast, hey, look at me, I've been fasting 3 days and the Lord answered me kind of thing. But can we corporately pray for a nation or pray for a bill before a Congress or something like that, or pray for a community that has been overwhelmed by a tragedy, hurricanes or whatever. I mean, to come together on a dedicated purpose and say, we're going to pray and fast for 3 days. The elders might call for that, and we might have daily meetings 3 times a day in the church, and truly dedicate our hearts and minds focused on some mission, so to speak. Is there anything wrong with that? I mean, I wouldn't have talked about it in the context of Esther because it takes us away from that. But that's what I want to talk about now, just for a moment. Just what's your opinion on praying and fasting corporately? Anybody have a negative, not when I say negative, I mean contrary opinion, not that it's negative.
I don't have a contrary opinion, but I have an opinion.
Yeah.
When Jesus was accused by the Pharisees that his disciples didn't fast, and all of their disciples did, they threw that up as an accusation. And he said, well, while the bridegroom's with them, they can't fast. But when the bridegroom is taken away, then they will fast. So Jesus expected them at a future time to be fasting when he was gone, because they would need to. It doesn't give a lot of instruction about it in the New Testament, how to accomplish that, how to go about it. But the fact that it was an expectation of Jesus and a normal flow of the events of life, I think is a very strong reason that we should do it. I don't think we do it enough. I think that we probably need more teaching, and I'm not an expert on it, but I think that that very thing implies that it is a New Testament scriptural activity.
Now, I know the New Testament was the time of miracles, but when the disciples went out 2 by 2, and they came back and they began to give their reports, they would say there were some things we couldn't do. How did Jesus answer that? Do you remember? How did he answer that in the context of what we're talking about? He said some things can only come by what? Prayer and fasting. Now, that obviously was a time of miracles. And he's saying sometimes what you're being asked to do won't be accomplished until maybe we make sure that we know that if it changes, it's God that changed it, not us. That's a hard thing to come to grips with. Why is something not changing in our lives? Or why is something not changing in our community or in the church or in the country or in the world? Faithful aren't fasting and praying is a real possibility. Because the hard things for us need to be turned over to God. And if we think that we can have a say in that matter, I think we're naive at least. And maybe proud at best. Or maybe I had those backwards. But you know what I mean. Maybe we think it's us that can make a change, and it's not us. On some of those hard things, it can never be us. It's got to be God. Anyway, and I think for those of you that were in the men's class last night, Chris alluded to that a little bit. Some things we can't change. We turn it over to God, and then things start happening. And I had a conversation with my brother-in-law last night about the same thing. So, such a time as this, it might be your time to influence. So through this praying and fasting, it appears as if Esther came up with a plan. Did she get it in a dream or vision? I don't know, but she's got a plan. And we'll talk a little bit about that tonight. She goes before the king. She's very hesitant because if the scepter's not bowed down in chapter 5, if he doesn't hold the scepter out to her, she doesn't get to approach. And she goes, she said, if I die, I die, and if I live, I live, but I'm going to go do this. And so she goes and does it, and the king invites her in, and she says, will you meet me for a banquet? And they have a banquet. Can you invite Haman? You invite Haman. Okay, what do you want, queen? Can you come back tomorrow? Let's do this again. And that's where we're going to be next week in chapter 6. In chapter 5, basically, I just labeled it, and I've seen this more and more. You know, for a couple years it was keep calm and let whatever, the t-shirt. What the new t-shirt now is faith and then a line and then the word fear underneath it. So faith over fear. I guess that's the new trend. That's something we've all been doing, but it's the idea of the courage to do the right thing when it looks like the odds are impossible against you. That's Esther in chapter 5. The odds are against her. At least she thinks so. King hasn't seen me in over 30 days. What makes me think I can just walk up and say, hey, king, by the way, did you know what the prime minister's doing? And the king's like, I didn't call you. Off with her head. Because she knows the king. What did he do to Vashti? Excommunicated her, and so when you get to chapter 5, we have to see it as more than just the queen's going to ask the king a favor or to talk to him about an important thing. There was a lot of, you can say anxiety, fear, contemplation, that your mind racing about the choice that you make. If I say it a little bit wrong, or I say it, or I'm too eager to make my ask kind of thing, what's the question? I don't know how many of you have ever had to stand before your mother or your father and ask them for something that you were assured they would say no. So you thought about it for several days and you went, and the timing was perfect, and they let you buy that motorcycle. And even gave you back the rent money you'd been giving them for 6 months to help pay for the motorcycle. Best day of my life, worst day of my life. All right, Chris, I think Chris had some. Anyway, that was my share for courage.
I was very impressed with the wisdom she showed, the way she went about doing this. I would have never thought, let me risk my life to ask him to a banquet, not to ask the question, but just to get him to come to a banquet. Butter him up for a day and then do it again. That was, I don't know the culture she was in and all. I mean, we talked about it, but I just think she was so wise to do what she did. And I think God gave her wisdom and all that. I don't give her all the credit for it, but I think we could learn from her.
Yep.
Sometimes we have something profound that we need to do. We might need to go about it a little bit differently than straight bluntly right into the middle of it.
Yeah, we'll talk a little bit about that in chapter 6. Yeah, because there's actually three occasions before she finally asks him. Anybody else before we close up? That's the first 5 chapters. Those are just some seed thoughts. I call them big ideas. They're just things that I saw that kind of illustrate what's going on in the book. And we'll do it again next week. Let's pray together. Father, we thank you for the evening. We thank you for the fellowship of the saints. It's what encourages us at this moment in time. Father, you are the great provider. We see everything as a blessing from you. Everything, Father, is a gift from you. Some of the things to correct us, some of the things to encourage us, some of the things just to let us celebrate. We need those times of refreshing. And Wednesday night, Father, for us is a refreshing time. Thank you for letting us come into your word, helping us to see the models of faith and sometimes even evil, so we can balance the two and hold on to one and resist the other. And just the comfort of the scriptures, the Old Testament, it benefits us in our faith in the 21st century. Thank you for loving us. Thank you for taking care of us. Give us safety in our travel home, Father. Thank you in Jesus' name. Amen. You've been a good